Chad, you were referred to me by a mutual acquaintance, Johnny. Thank you, Johnny. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into kind of an overview of what you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. So I joined the Army National Guard in 2007, and I served overseas in Djibouti in 2012. And I had been a bit of a runner before I went overseas. Not anything stellar, but I would run about 13 miles at an 8:30 pace at my peak. PT test about 14-minute 2 mile was a good one for me. So when I went overseas, we had different duty locations. One of my duty locations was working overnight on a small team downwind from where they were burning trash. And we would kind of sit in this haze, and my eyes and throat would burn all night. So by the end of the time in Djibouti, I failed my first PT test ever, and I couldn't run 2 miles within like 19 minutes or something. And I got home, and I had asthma attacks. I ended up going to the hospital at a certain point in time, not for that, but they did I think it's a CT scan, and they pulled me aside and they kind of said, look, you've got some nodules in your lungs, and we really think you should have them looked at. And this was at the VA hospital. But there was no referral to any sort of specialist or anything, no indication of burning trash or anything at all. So worried I had cancer, I did a lot of research. I learned about burn pits. This was around 2015, 2016. And as I learned about it, it really bothered me. At the time, I was studying graduate level statistics. I had worked on a special project in anti-money laundering where I was working on tuning the algorithms. And I'm not a mathematician by any means, but I was just sort of a doer, crunching numbers and looking at things. And I took that knowledge and I applied it to the research I was reading. Really, essentially, I feel like the VA was leaning on that research to say that everything's inconclusive and there's no correlation or causation apparent with the burning trash. And it kind of kicked off this passion for me of, if I have these concerns, I didn't have it that bad. I was in Djibouti where they're burning God knows what, but I learned about what they did in Iraq and exposures in Afghanistan and other places. And it sort of ignited this passion to try and fix this problem.
And you were in University of Pennsylvania studying, working, you said, with predictive analytics, doing money laundering?
So that was my career progression. When I came home, I found my footing after a while, and I got into anti-money laundering. And then I grew from there, and I got on an IT modernization project elsewhere. And I was studying statistics at Temple University because I was supposed to be working on anti-fraud technology, and my job sort of changed over time. But what I found was that nobody would listen to me. I reached out to my legislators, and I said, look, I'm studying graduate level statistics, and I'm telling you there were problems with the methodologies being used, and there's a big problem here. I couldn't get any response. So I said, I've got to get a platform. And I kind of elbowed my way into the program at University of Pennsylvania, and it worked. People would listen to me. So I got into a public administration program, and that's sort of, in a way, my intent was it was a crossover that the government needs to fix this problem. So I'm advocating to the government, and that was my capstone in that program.
Okay. So I kind of would like to get a little bit into how this works. Just as you and I have spoken, you used the example on one of your emails with glioblastoma, which for me, working in neurocritical care, that's my jam right there. So could you maybe give us a little bit of an example of taking if you have a few individuals with a glioblastoma cluster, kind of how that would work and how analytics can help shine a light on that problem and what it can do for other individuals?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to explain that effectively, I want to tie that back to what I view as one of the most prominent research papers thus far on the burn pits, and that's the 2011 paper that was done by the National Academies of Sciences. And that was, I feel like, leaned on very heavily as the results are inconclusive. There's no evidence of a problem. Kind of the challenge that we see, right? And what they did was deep in that 100 plus pages of report that I think very few people read. It says, well, we don't know exactly what was burned. We don't know exactly who was exposed, and we don't know exactly for how long. So what we've done is we've sampled from the Airborne Hazards Registry. I believe that's what they sampled from. And something to the extent of within a 5-mile radius of burn pits. And so knowing that is kind of the unfortunate state of research as it is today, where they're doing random sampling from a registry and contrasting that to what data can do with a more targeted approach, right? So in anti-money laundering, you set parameters and you identify what's outside of the norm, and it sets off an alert. And we do this in many industries. We do this in marketing. That there's a ton of money in this in marketing. Businesses set parameters and look for trends in the data for various different purposes. So with that backdrop, back to your original question there, it ties into identifying clusters, right? So instead of doing random sampling from a voluntary database, a very highly flawed methodology right there, what I'm proposing is that we need better data science to support the science. And the example I used was if there was a platoon, let's say my platoon I deployed with, if one person develops glioblastoma, that's an anomaly, right? But there's no communication, there's no longitudinal studies. So if a second person develops it, that's an aberration, that's abnormal. But if 3 people develop glioblastoma, that's supposed to be an incidence of something, I think, like, I don't have the numbers offhand, but maybe 3 in 100,000, right? So if you get 3 in 40, that's an alarm right there. That's a problem.
Right. 2 points to the line and 3 points to the pattern.
Yeah, right. And that is the foundation of what I'm advocating for, because you take that and you can extrapolate it, right? So if you can break it down to the smallest possible cluster, like let's say a platoon size element or something, and then that fits within a company and a battalion, right? So you've got this data set, and frankly, that number of cases within even a battalion should set off an alarm, right? But it allows you to key in on the problem. So you've got a group of people who may have been stationed in Iraq in 2007, and maybe you find that's part of the problem, right? Maybe you key in on a location, a certain point in time, and there's many different facets to that. But right, it's sort of just building out the universe of veterans and finding ways to monitor for pockets of illness.
What you're describing with how they did the 2011 study sounds kind of like if I'm doing a Google search and I want to find out about one particular unit that my cousin searched in, I could search U.S. Army unit, and I might get how many hundreds of thousands of entries. But then if I can lower it down to engineer or infantry and give a little bit more descriptive about it, then you can get more specific. Is that probably a relatively valid similarity?
That's it. Yeah, it's a great example, and there are many different ways to slice and dice this data, right? You've got groups of people who probably had similar exposures, and then we know from similar toxic exposure research, like firefighters. So you've got certain jobs, pilots that you want to monitor, and you may know that this group is at a higher risk. Instead of just throwing a dart at a randomly sampled database that's full of voluntary respondents, it's I might get chastised by some mathematicians, but I call that sort of like p hacking, right? You're almost intentionally. Some people do it to find what they want, or it almost looks like you're conducting these studies with an overly generalized group that is not necessarily representative of what you're trying to look at. So it's a very flawed system as it is today.
Well, and from a medical perspective, assuming for a second, and this is a very big assumption, but assuming you could get every neurologist in the country on board with the idea that burn pits could be causing some of these problems or other exposures that people have had, maybe that we haven't narrowed down enough yet. Um, it, something like glioblastoma has a better outcome if you identify it earlier. However, it's not necessarily a good idea to just go and scan every individual every year, every 2 years. So this would at least help them to narrow down as well.
Yeah, exactly. And this is, I've done a little bit of research, and you get into some issues where kind of over monitoring, like for example, with the nuclear meltdown in Fukushima, there are some studies out about how they were doing really extensive studies of the civilians around, and by over monitoring, they were getting misleading information. They were finding tumors and growths, and it became kind of a problem, right? So it's sort of this balance of just trying to look for problems without looking too hard or looking the wrong way, right? So yeah, it's definitely a balance.
So as you were going through with Pennsylvania and going through some of these, you had come up with a couple of challenges, one being that the VA has incomplete data, which of course goes in, well, actually, let's talk about that for a second. Can you just give a quick summary on that?
Yeah, so this is a really fascinating component of the conversation, and this is it's the cornerstone of effective research. So I've had quite a few really interesting experiences with this. I started out my advocacy blaming the researchers, and then I cold called the researchers. I cold called the Center of Excellence in New Jersey, and I got to meet them, and they're very good people. They are working diligently. They don't have, and these are my words, but they don't have the data. I know that they care, but when I started digging in, and I sat on a call with the director of post-deployment health at the VA, and he said on the call that we have the data we need, and I was incredulous. I had to ask again. I didn't want to challenge him on the call. I was a guest, but he said, "Yeah, we've got the data we need," and they don't. And what really proves that, I think, is the issue of K2 right now. And you'll have a hard time getting the VA to admit that they don't have the data they need, because they'll kind of dance around the question. But if you were to say, can you tell me, you've got this person who on their deathbed was saying that it was from burn pits that they're working near. Have you checked in with their platoon? And I'm inclined to think the answer is almost always no. I don't know if they ever have. So K2 is a case in point where it's kind of like a gotcha, because there's all this activity focused on studying the toxic exposures at K2, and lo and behold, they don't have the data. They have to get the Pentagon to give them the data. So I got to go to the White House in 2019 and talk to the president's advisor on Veterans Affairs. And I said that I had 30 seconds to pitch him. And I said, look, you got to get the Pentagon to give them the data. And apparently that's kind of a non-starter in DC. So it's a big problem. Yeah.
And then challenge 2, the VA is refractory to toxic exposure concerns and continues to resist calls to action, even regarding toxic exposures that occurred decades ago.
Yeah, so the tie into Agent Orange, right? We are we're seeing that still. We're seeing this resistance, and the Blue Water Navy vets, right? And the fights that have dragged out there. So we haven't even solved that yet, unfortunately. And all the work that our Vietnam veterans have done for us to advocate, and we're still not getting ahead of it. We're still in this reactionary state of these inconclusive studies because of bad data, and there's really not a lot of forward thinking on this stuff.
So you've done work with Pennsylvania. You've called various individuals, the Warfighter team over in New Jersey. Got to go to the White House and speak with them a little bit. If I remember correctly, I think one of the articles I read said that you'd also done some work with the VFW on this issue.
Yeah. So I've done some networking. You know, I feel like I'm actually in a position of advantage because I'm not associated with any particular organization or VSO. I'm an independent voice on this, and I'm just trying to hit home on what I perceive to be one of the solutions. It's a multifaceted problem. I have one piece of the solution, but I'm not beholden to donors or anything like that. I'm just trying to solve a problem. Yeah.
What things do you think would help to approach next on this issue?
That's a great question. So we've got multiple fronts of this problem, right? So, for example, the low-hanging fruit, the easiest possible thing to fix is stopping burning trash. And I think it was my own congresswoman here in Pennsylvania that introduced that language into the NDAA a year or two ago. It was still a little bit loose, which I understand, right? You got to leave some carve outs for certain special situations. So that, you know, that's the very first, most basic starting point, and we're just now getting to that now. I believe they're actually still burning trash in some locations. So that's one piece. The other piece is the care for the people who are sick right now, and you'll see that's a big problem. That's not my focus with what I'm working on, but I feel like it shouldn't conflict. So, you know, you've got these issues of presumption of illness and specialty and care. You've got veterans going into the VA to some VA doctors who still don't know about these issues. But the presumption issue does tie in directly with what I'm working on, which is I feel like the bird's eye view vantage point of how to fix this problem is catching the illness before, you know, catching it early. So with presumption, what we're seeing is some really positive efforts to push this through legislation. I think it's Senator Gillibrand and Congressman Ruiz, who I've interacted with his office, and they've been fantastic. They're very informed on this. So they're pushing for presumption. I think that's fair because we know that toxins were burned. What they did would have been illegal in the United States. We know that these things are carcinogenic when they're burned. So I think it's a very valid argument. And the pushback is that the results are inconclusive. So therein lies my third piece of getting the data together. Because if we're still having this fight for years, well, at some point in time, the data is going to prove it. And what I'm trying to say is let's not keep kicking this can and fighting for 30 years because the studies are probably going to be pretty faulty until they get the correct data. So maybe those two arguments can go hand in hand. Keep pushing for presumption because we know that there were toxic exposures, but at the same time, let's get the data right. And if we don't arrive at presumption soon enough, then the data will get us there.
So you're speaking about people at the VA who felt that they had enough information, but then when you'd ask certain questions, it's like, well, we don't have that. Is there any other recommendations you would have to individuals working on that field about how to better get the search parameters to identify individuals?
So if I understand that question correctly, I think there are different problems, right? So you've got the awareness within the VA, and I don't have a solution to that. I think that the VA's establishment of these different centers of excellence and the research they're doing is a starting point. I hope that the VA is directing more people to those specific research centers. I think they're in San Francisco area, um, East Orange, New Jersey, and then there might be one in DC. They have various different functions, but I think you've got to build that knowledge out within the VA. But you do have some significant problems. Like I didn't go. I went to the VA initially, and then I went to private practice. So that's unfortunately a different creature. Is trying to figure out how to get the specialization and awareness. I Yeah.
Well, that's something that's interesting with private practice. Again, using Glio as an example, I've had a couple of veterans come through on our floor, and at one point, I just wanted to gauge where one of our neurosurgeons was at in terms of even being receptive to an issue of could this have some sort of causality in this group. Um, and keeping in mind, this was a very short 2-second conversation. I didn't grill him. I just wanted to see where he was at. But his response had been, "Oh, this sounds to me like the Agent Orange nonsense. Unfortunately, sometimes people just have something bad that happens and it's traumatic, and because of that, they want something to blame." And this is a really, really sharp doctor. If I had a tumor, I would trust him to cut it out of me or of my wife if it came down to it. So it's kind of disheartening to hear that. And it overlooks certain arguments. Like if I were to ask him, well, what definitively causes glioblastoma? He's not going to be able to give me an answer because he doesn't know. None of
Mm-hmm.
us do. But the whole overlap then within the civilian care sector for all of us who don't have VA access creates this other entanglement too that so many people are snared up in.
Yeah, so that actually, I'd like to tie that back to my proposal and the solution as I see it, right? Because there's no real perfect solution to the data, and I don't mean a solution to this problem because you can't undo the toxic exposures. There is no good solution. The best we can do is get ahead of it. So we've got this issue of missing data, and that's a really critical element of this VA burn pit registry. And I know there's good intent there. I signed up for the registry almost 10 years ago, and I don't really know how to navigate it. I don't know anything about it anymore. I just signed up one time. So you've got this element of a lot of missing data from there. And there are different ways to fill those voids, at least as well as humanly possible, right? You've got to have a component for people who are informed to be more informed, essentially. But people who are informed enough to go into that registry and be able to denote their file, right? When their health conditions change, if they're going to a private practice provider, you're never going to have the proper crossover in the data. They have these data requests that go out. I know that's part of what they do, but I think you've got to have a self-reporting mechanism. And within that mechanism, allow people to upload their own medical records from private practice, and that gives some fidelity to the data, right? You can have an unverified diagnosis and then support it with documentation. And so that's one piece of it. And then the other piece would be, unfortunately, when people pass away, linking in with, I'm pretty sure there are some federal databases that might inventory that. I don't know the level of detail they have, but being able to track mortality amongst veterans. So you've got some missing data problems within the registry, right? And you got to try and put it together so you can find these problems. And the last comment there is, family member reporting for those who are incapacitated and deceased. I know that's been a conversation point. It's a very important piece of this puzzle.
So, excuse me. Anytime I speak with experts, I'm always interested in saying, hey, what can other people who are in a position to provide treatment and options do? And I think that's a huge issue. But I also think that there's a huge issue with what can we as either service members, veterans, patients, all of the above do too, because it can't just be what does others do for us, what do we also do for ourselves and for each other? Would you have any recommendations there?
I think, this is sort of big picture. This is not burn pit. I served as lower enlisted. I try to check in, just to be a Facebook group and try and check in with people. And there's a component of that of trying to put my feelers out to see if anyone else, like initially in 20, I think 15 or so, I started out asking like, hey, I got asthma. Do any of you guys have asthma after that deployment? Or so that was sort of almost like the seedling of this whole effort. And it goes back to just keeping in touch and checking in with people. I think that's a big, important component of the veteran community, right? Looking out for each other. I've had very good experiences interacting with different VSOs, depending on your cause, right? So VFW, I worked with them. I reached out to Rosie Torres at Burn Pits 360 in 2016, and I've kept in touch with her. So if there's a certain passion, right, you can link up with the right group for it. Did some work with homeless veterans, like just finding a good group of people who have similar passions and concerns and interests. Yeah.
Is there anything else that you can think of that you would like to add?
I think the only thing I would like to add is a sense of urgency to this, in that this conversation at the forefront tends to be burn pits, but toxic exposures take many shapes and forms. And to what that doctor told, I think you said told you about, you don't know what caused it, right? That's true. It might not have been the burn pits. There are many different toxic exposures that our service members endured. It could be the dust, right? It could be the confluence of the burned trash and the dust, and there are many pieces of this, and it doesn't just affect the deployed service members. You've got the PFAS and the water all over the bases in the United States, right? So when you're trying to compare, like, why is this group a little bit more sick than this group to the regular citizen? Well, shoot, if your comparison is people who are stationed at Fort Bragg or something, who had toxic water, well, oh yeah, they both have high rates of cancer. Maybe it's because they smoke too much, right? So you get into these unproductive conversations that you need data to effectively address, right? We need to have a holistic understanding of what's making our service members sick, and the awareness that it's probably many things, unfortunately.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, I appreciate it, and thank you for covering this. This is it's amazing that it's been going on for so long, and even after Agent Orange. But it takes people like you and all these other organizations to cover this stuff, to get people engaged and get solutions.
Appreciate that.